This is the last of my 8-lecture series entitled Understanding Science. Thanks to the many people who've watched these lectures or who have commented on them so far. Please spread the word if you think that these lectures are useful. This lecture is on one of my favourite topics, logical fallacies. In other words, the common mistakes that people make when they're putting forward an argument, either about a particular scientific theory or even just in everyday discussions. Today I'll be looking at what it takes to make a good argument and what we can do to guard against sloppy reasoning in our own thoughts, as well as learning to spot it in arguments that we may have heard or we may read online. So let's get started. So what does it mean to say that an argument is valid or incorrect? Well, first of all, let's look at what we mean by an argument. An argument is so much more than a punch-up in a bar. What I'm talking about in this lecture is logical arguments. That is the linguistic structure you put in place to get from a disordered pile of facts and relationships to build up a coherent network of knowledge and understanding that can be used to derive information about the world around you. What we're really talking about in this lecture is deductive arguments, which is a special kind of argument that is much loved by philosophers and mathematicians, but which underlies all analytical thought. By that, I mean the area of thought that deals with combining things that you already know to make assertions about things that you did not yet know, or at least that you weren't aware that you knew. A deductive argument has two premises. These are facts that you already know. And it also has a conclusion, which is a statement that is demonstrated to be true based on the application of simple laws of logic to those two facts. So, for example, if I know that all dogs are mammals, and Rover is a dog, then I know that Rover must be a mammal. My two premises here are, firstly, all dogs are mammals, and secondly, Rover is a dog. Those are two facts that I know about the world around me. Then I can combine those in a logically coherent way to derive the conclusion that Rover must be a mammal. The conclusion is inescapable from the premises. That is to say, there is no way the conclusion could possibly be false, provided the premises are both true and I've combined them in a logically correct manner. Notice also that the conclusion here is 100% definitely true and that I don't have to go out and measure Rover to make sure that it's correct. I don't need any experimentation whatsoever. The conclusion is correct purely by the laws of logic. However, not all arguments are correct, and there are two main ways that an argument can be incorrect. Firstly, the argument can be logically sound but with false premises. For example, all dogs are reptiles, Rover is a dog, therefore Rover is a reptile. Now, clearly the logic here is perfectly sound. If the premises were true, then the conclusion would necessarily follow. But the premises are not true because dogs are not reptiles. A second way that a deductive argument can be wrong is if the premises are correct but the logic to connect them is faulty. For example, all dogs are mammals, Rover is a dog, therefore Rover speaks fluent English. Now, the two premises are definitely true. Dogs are mammals and Rover is a dog, but the conclusion simply does not follow from the two premises. It's what's called a non sequitur. We'll meet those again later. Finally, it's worth pointing out that arguments can be faulty, but still arrive accidentally at a true conclusion, almost by luck. For example, if I said, all dogs are mammals, Tiddles is a cat, therefore Tiddles is a mammal. The conclusion is correct, as it happens in this case, but only because, by fortune, cats also happen to be mammals. But that fact was not included in the argument, so the conclusion of the argument does not follow from its premises. Deductive arguments are one case of argument, but there is another one that might be a bit more familiar to you, namely the inductive argument. Inductive arguments involve collecting data, examples, and experience, and attempting to spot patterns that generate new knowledge. So, for example, if I were to press the power button on my monitor now, it would switch off. I could do that several times, and each time it would switch off. So I could form an inductive argument that says, pressing the power button on my monitor switches it off. The difference between an inductive argument and a deductive one is that inductive arguments are always tentative. They're basically what the majority of science is founded on. Because I have no logical reason to assume that the next time I press the power button on my monitor, it will switch off again. I'm just assuming that it will because it always has in the past. By the way, I ought to give a quick thank you to the guys at the Skeptic's Guide to the Universe podcast for giving a list of what they think are the most important logical fallacies. Please take a look at their website and listen to their great podcast, which is produced weekly and covers a range of scientific and skeptical topics, such as those that we've covered throughout this course. I've taken their list and slightly modified it to make up the list of fallacies that I'll be covering in this lecture. The first class of logical fallacies that I want to look at are arguments from ignorance. This is a class of argument that relies on some aspect of the ignorance of either the arguer or the listener to attempt to prove its point. Remember, what I'm talking about here is failures in logic as part of attempted logical arguments. So these are all examples of types of argument that are often used, especially by pseudoscientists, but also by mainline scientists too. But yet they don't work. That is to say, they fail to establish what they try to establish. The first one I want to cover is the appeal to ignorance, otherwise known by the Latin name ad ignorantiam. The form of this argument would go something like, my claim is true because you can't prove that it's false. It's a staple of conspiracy theorists and also features heavily in philosophy of religion. An example here would be, I believe that aliens built the pyramids. Unless you can prove otherwise, then my idea is at least as plausible as yours. Other common examples are to be found in philosophy of religion, as I said, such as the appeal to the existence of an immaterial, undetectable, timeless, otherworldly soul that conveniently can't be captured, detected, measured, or otherwise shown to exist in any way. The second fallacy in this group is the fallacy that equates unexplained with unexplainable. Just because we haven't yet managed to explain something, that doesn't mean that we never will. And it certainly doesn't mean that all potential explanations are still equally viable. Creationism is a source of many of these arguments, most noticeably around the origins of life itself, the process known as abiogenesis, by which self-replicating molecules first formed. We have several plausible models for this process, but none is absolutely secure yet, and it would be fair to say that we don't really know what the answer is. But that doesn't mean that it was impossible, that it never happened, and that the first living creatures, or indeed the Earth itself, were magicked into existence by a divine creator. It doesn't mean that there isn't a creator either, of course. Thirdly, the argument from personal incredulity. Again, this is used in many arguments based on intuition, with which creationism is, of course, liberally sprinkled. The argument form is that something is claimed to be impossible because the arguer cannot himself or herself conceive of how it could be true. A good example is the ongoing attempt by intelligent design creationist Michael Behe to attempt to prove that some aspects of life are too complicated to have evolved. And his argument for why these structures are too complicated seems, as far as I can tell, to be that he just can't think of how they could have evolved. Fortunately, however, far better scientists can indeed think of perfectly plausible ways in which such structures can evolve and illustrate them with copious examples, as the transcript from the 2005 trial of Kitzmiller versus Dover Area School District shows perfectly well. During this trial, Dr. Behe attempted to put forward his case for intelligent design creationism and was blown out of the water by scientific counterargument. The next group of fallacies I want to cover fall under the general heading of personal arguments. That is, arguments that cover the nature of the arguer or of some other person relevant to the argument, rather than focusing on the facts of the argument itself. The first of these, and one of the most common logical fallacies that you will ever encounter, is the personal attack, more commonly known by the Latin ad hominem, which means to the man. That is to say, an argument that is aimed at the person making a case rather than at the case itself. The basic structure of this fallacy is that some argument is claimed to be false because of the person who states it, or some other person who upholds the same views. One such argument could be that vegetarianism is wrong because Hitler was a vegetarian and look at what he did. Apart from instantly losing the argument via Godwin's law, which states that the first person in any argument to mention Hitler is the loser, this argument is clearly faulty because the nature or beliefs of a person holding a belief are irrelevant for determining whether or not the belief is correct. This feels a bit odd at first because, if you think about it, in other areas of life, such as hearsay evidence and criminal trials, the character of the witness on the stand is very much of importance. If the witness is known to be untrustworthy and unreliable, then very little weight should be given to his or her testimony. But the difference with the scientific debate is quite important. What we're talking about here is not a case that you just have to take someone's word for it or not. It's a scientific proposal, which is therefore susceptible to empirical proof or disproof, regardless of who it might have been who proposed it. Just because someone is evil or untrustworthy or nasty or rude, it doesn't mean they're wrong. Arguments should be evaluated on their own merits, not the characteristics of the people putting them forward. In an earlier presentation, I said that just because an argument might be put forward by a non-expert, that doesn't mean that it's necessarily wrong. After all, Albert Einstein was a patent clerk when he wrote his first scientific papers. In fact, Einstein is a good example of a way that this particular logical fallacy can be completely flipped on its head. Not only should we not reject arguments because of the bad character of the people proposing them, we also shouldn't naturally accept arguments purely because of the good character of people proposing them. Many flavours of pseudoscientists use this trick to attempt to convince their listeners that the particular nonsense that they're espousing has actually some merits. After all, they say, Professor Smith said that this was true and he has a Nobel Prize. The prime example of this is the creationists' use of Professor Fred Hoyle, a brilliant cosmologist who unfortunately became stuck in his ways and refused to accept many of the findings of modern astrophysics, and biology come to mention it. And he was a highly respected physicist, Fellow of the Royal Society and all-round genius, but that doesn't mean he was right, and the majority of scientists disagreed with him, and it turns out that they were almost always right to do so. For example, in Hoyle's insistence of steady-state models of the universe, which were comprehensively shown to be wrong, though he denied that at every opportunity. The extension of this argument is the argument from Einstein and the argument from Newton, namely, just because Einstein or Newton believes something to be true, it must be true. After all, who are we when compared to such great minds? Well, who are we is people who are alive in the second decade of the 21st century, after a very long time after the death of both of these illustrious men, and the intervening years have seen a great number of scientific advances that contradicted the findings of them both. Again, it doesn't matter who came up with a theory, all that matters is whether or not it stands up to empirical and theoretical scrutiny. So next we look at two subtle empirical arguments, that is, arguments based on real-world findings that allegedly bear on the truth or falsehood of a proposition. The first is the infamous argument from consequences. This argument takes the form that a claim is true or false based on the consequences that it implies. Creationism is full of these, including the famous Darwinism leads to Nazism idea. It's completely false, of course, as a glance around university biology campuses will show you, practically 100% of the faculty of which wholeheartedly support the truth of Darwinian evolution, and they don't seem to be hotbeds of violent anti-Semitism. In fact, quite the opposite. But it's also irrelevant what the implications of a theory might be, of course. After all, if we discovered a comet that was on a collision course for Earth, which would wipe out the entirety of the human race, nobody would accept the argument, your data about this comet must be faulty because that would mean that we're all going to die. Yet that's pretty much what the creationists argue in some cases. A similar argument is not that the truth of an argument has negative implications, therefore we shouldn't accept it, but rather that merely accepting an argument, whether or not it's true, causes negative consequences. That's something like what the Darwinism causes Nazism argument is attempting to argue. Again, it doesn't matter whether or not the acceptance of a particular theory causes people to turn into immoral psychopaths. What matters is whether or not the theory itself is correct. At least that's what matters for the purposes of scientific investigation. And besides, I'm yet to be convinced that there is any truth about the universe that, upon accepting it, makes people less moral. On the contrary, I tend to find that the more people study the way the universe actually works and learn to think rationally and base their arguments on truth instead of dogma and guesswork, the more moral they become. And I think that's backed up by the evidence too. The second major logical fallacy in this section is the infamous correlation and causation confusion. In other words, just because two measurements are correlated, that doesn't mean that one causes the other. There are various arguments in this umbrella. Let's say that a pseudoscientist will argue that A is correlated with B, therefore A causes B. Now, there are three possible ways that this can be wrong. Firstly, of course, the correlation might be imaginary. It might just be an artifact of the data. Secondly, it might be the other way round. It might be that A and B are correlated because B causes A. A good example here is the common claim that violent video games lead to violent behaviour because the two are correlated. Whereas I find it much more plausible that people who are otherwise predisposed to violent behaviour will tend to play more violent video games, and so the causation actually works the other way around. I don't believe anyone has ever proved differently. The more cunning variety of this particular fallacy, however, is caused by a more subtle case, where A and B are correlated because they're both caused by some third factor, C. The favourite example of a statistics professor is the claim that taller people are cleverer than smaller people. And the correlation is indeed very strong. Performance on a standardised IQ test varies quite strongly with height. And the audience no doubt scratch their heads thinking about arguments about brain size or malnutrition or something, when somebody realises that the reason for this is that IQ and height are both, of course, strongly correlated with age. After all, babies are tiny and they do really badly on a standardised IQ test. A 6-year-old would do marginally better but still poorly, a teenager better still, and an adult best of all. And of course I should add that pretty much every ism that afflicts our society has its basis in this particular logical fallacy. For example, a certain racial group are more likely to be criminals because of their skin colour, where it is far more likely that skin colour correlates with poverty, say, which correlates with crime, and so on. There are, of course, pure logical errors in the form of an argument that are somewhat more subtle than the other errors I've shown so far. For example, the false deduction, also known as non sequitur, from the Latin for "it does not follow." Non sequiturs concern irrational steps in an argument which are often cunningly hidden behind layers of obfuscation and confusion. There are simple examples, of course, such as all dogs are mammals, Rover is a dog, therefore Rover has 2 legs. The premises are both true, but the conclusion obviously doesn't follow, and it's of course false. In fact, even if the conclusion were true, this would still be a non sequitur because the logic isn't valid. So, for example, all dogs are mammals, Rover is a dog, therefore Rover has a tail, is still an example of a non sequitur, because there are mammals without tails. Humans, for example. More subtle examples might include old favourites such as all dogs are mammals, Rover is a mammal, therefore Rover is a dog. Again, the premises and conclusion are all true, but the argument is false, if you think about it. Just because Rover is a mammal, it doesn't mean that he's a dog, even though all dogs are mammals, because plenty of other animals can also be mammals, such as cats and rabbits and horses. The second common fallacy in this section is the fallacy of begging the question. Note that this doesn't mean what most people think it means, i.e. raising the question. That's an incorrect usage of the term, but it's beginning to stick, so instead I'll call this particular fallacy circular reasoning. The flaw here is that the arguer deliberately or accidentally assumes the truth of the claim that he is attempting to prove, as part of the argument he's using to prove that claim. So, for example, radiometric dating is wrong because it gives ages of the Earth that are older than 10,000 years. Is a creationist trick that uses circular reasoning to attempt to prove that the Earth is young, but it's assuming that their proposition is correct in the first place and attempting to use that to prove something that they're then going to use to prove that their proposition is correct, if you see what I mean. Philosophy of religion is also full of examples of this, such as the famous ontological argument. A tautology is a bit like an example of circular reasoning. In it, somebody simply states the same thing in different ways, and makes it sound like they've made a great discovery. A common use of this is the parents' ever-popular backup argument of, because I said so, that's why. Note that this will probably annoy any logicians who use the word tautology in a slightly different way to mean a statement that conveys no information, such as pretty much everything ever written by a psychic or astrologer. For example, you are sometimes a bold person, but you also have your timid moments. You are playful, but sometimes you also like to rest. You're strong, but there are times that bring out your inner weaknesses. And so on. We're nearly through the list, just 2 categories to go. The next one is all to do with comparisons. A false analogy happens when someone attempts to use an analogy to represent an opponent's claim, but then they take the analogy to extents where it breaks down completely, but all the while claiming that the analogy holds, and therefore the argument that is allegedly analogous to also fails. So, for example, evolution is a random process, just like how a strong wind might distribute light objects when it blows. Okay, so far slightly suspicious, but not entirely false. I mean, evolution has random drivers, but it is inherently a non-random process. But let's listen on. The second part of this argument will go something like, so to think that evolution could cause the appearance of complex life like human beings is like imagining that a tornado could blow through a junkyard and produce a fully working aircraft. Of course, the analogy is ridiculous, and it's easy to see why, but it is still powerful, especially for people who are predisposed to believing it. This argument is closely linked to the straw man argument that we'll see on the next slide. Another false comparison is the false continuum argument. There are 2 forms of this, but both involve comparing a set of states to a smooth continuum and either falsely accepting the comparison or falsely rejecting it. To give an example, this crops up a lot in politics, where one side attempts to claim that a law change from the other side is going to result in terrible consequences. For example, you impose greater controls on firearms and then you'll be banning them altogether, and then you'll start banning other things, and then you'll just control the entire population and use them as slaves. Or whatever it is gun nuts believe. Of course, this is not a smooth continuum without any demarcations. There are some very clear boundaries in this process, and accepting that you wish to take the first step does not in any way mean that you want to take subsequent steps. Also, sometimes there is a clear continuum between 2 extremes and somebody will reject it, such as where people attempt to divide all human beings into good and bad, or the classic philosophical argument that there are no bold men. How do you know? Well, start with a man with a full head of hair. Now pull out one hair. Is he bald? No. Then continue. Pull out another hair. Is he bald yet? No. Continue. To say that at some point he's bald and at one point he's not bald means you have to make a completely arbitrary distinction somewhere along the line between a full head of hair and no hair. And there's obviously no point that clearly distinguishes between the two cases, so it can't be done. At least not with any logical backing. A related argument, building on the rejection of a continuum, is the false dichotomy. This is the case where an arguer falsely claims that only two possible claims can be made. He then denies one and is forced to conclude the other. This is often used in medical pseudoscience, where a quack will claim something like, big pharmaceutical companies do some horrible things, therefore we know that they're not on our side and therefore they're evil and want to keep us all ill for their own nefarious ends. Well, it's not the case that a company is either wholly good or wholly evil, so proving that a company has done some bad things is not the same as proving that they are the source of all evil. They could just be somewhere in between the two extremes. So there are a few really sneaky arguments that are occasionally used to support pseudoscience, and these are ones that you'll find abundant evidence of in the literature, as they are often the tactics used by professional fraudsters and hoaxers, not to mention those who make a career out of promoting pseudoscience and nonsense. Psychics often use a technique called moving the goalposts. In fact, it's worth looking up online the magician James Randi, that's R-A-N-D-I, who runs an educational foundation which, among other things, seeks to test those who claim to have supernatural powers. He often tests people who claim to be able to perform a wide range of psychic miracles, and they all, without exception, fail miserably at any sort of controlled test of their powers. Then, again without exception, they always fall back to the good old moving the goalposts trick. Despite the fact that they always agree on the precise nature of the test beforehand, this is a point where they claim that there was something about the test that meant that their powers didn't work. Perhaps it was the presence of those skeptics who filled the atmosphere with their negative energy. So their powers are still perfectly real, it's just that the test they failed wasn't the right kind of test. The straw man argument is one of the most common arguments used by pseudoscientists, especially creationists. You've heard something similar to this already, the tornado in a junkyard argument that we covered under the section of false analogies. The straw man is an argument where someone makes a caricature of a theory that they're arguing against, then they proceed to disprove the caricature and pretend that this actually disproves the real theory. For example, evolution says that mud turns into people. Well, I've been staring at this mud for ages and I don't think I see anything happening. Or the now infamous video where a staggeringly ignorant creationist attempts to prove that life cannot evolve from chemicals by claiming that nobody has ever seen spontaneously created life inside a newly opened peanut butter jar. The next one is a bit bizarre, and it's known in skeptic circles as the no true Scotsman fallacy. The basis of this is that the imagined scene where a Scottish nationalist is saying about how brave and loyal and honest all Scottish people are, when he's shown a story of a Scottish man who turned out to be a thief or a murderer. Then the Scottish apologist merely replies that this man couldn't have been a true Scotsman because no true Scotsman would behave like that because, as he already said, true Scotsmen are brave and honest and loyal. Psychics love this one. When they see that other psychics have failed some test of their powers, and they usually retort, well, they weren't true psychics. A true psychic would be able to pass that test. I'm a true psychic, by the way, and there are many of us. This fallacy is often used in reverse by racists when shown an example of good deeds done by members of some hated minority. Finally, there's the legendary Gish Gallop. Not so much a logical fallacy, this, more a tactic used in debates to get one up on your opponent. The infamous creationist Dwayne Gish, now in his 90s I believe, was a well-known terror of the debating circuit because his tactic was to spew forth an endless torrent of claims and alleged proofs and disproofs. So many that there was no way that any opponent could ever have kept up with them all, let alone disproved every single one of them. For a start, it almost always takes way longer to disprove a false claim than it does to make the false claim in the first place, so the galloper is working with a huge head start already. But also, even attempting to counter a Gish Gallop means that the other side is forced to spend all of his or her time countering arguments from the opposition instead of offering new arguments of their own. The inevitable extension of the Gish Gallop is that Gish, or anyone else employing this technique, would follow up by pointing out that their opposition totally failed to address the majority of his points, and that they therefore must not be able to answer them, presumably because they don't know what they're talking about, therefore I win. Yeah, it's not exactly rock-solid logic, but then again neither are any of these arguments. Let's wrap things up and see what we've learned. I think the main thing to take away about the whole field of logical fallacies is that it's possible to build a very superficially convincing argument in a debate using entirely fallacious reasoning. Some of the examples I've shown here have been obvious, but others have not been obvious, and often it's hard to put one's finger on exactly what was wrong with the argument you've just heard. Debates are a terrible place to ascertain what is true and what's false, because the format is stacked massively in favour of people who use sneaky, underhand tricks to get ahead. It's also highly stacked in favour of the side with the most intuitively appealing argument, regardless of whether or not it's actually true. Anyway, we've learned in this lecture that all good thinking is built on logical arguments. There are two main types, and they're both vital in science. So far in this course, we've mainly focused on inductive arguments, that is, arguments based on going out and making measurements about the world. In a sense, inductive arguments are the only way that we gain new knowledge about the universe. Deductive arguments are only used to shuffle around our existing knowledge and to form it into logically coherent frameworks upon which further discoveries can be placed. Within the sphere of argumentation, and especially in debates, logical fallacies are a very common occurrence. Sometimes they're used by accident, often by someone who's not been trained in logic. Often, however, they're used deliberately by one side to attempt to win a sneaky victory over the other, and to win converts for their own fallacious point of view. The top creationists in the world today are all masters of using the above techniques to make their absurd claims sound reasonable to the untrained ears. Recognising logical fallacies is vital when you want to spot where others are making bad arguments, and also when you want to avoid making these mistakes yourself. But good thinking is a skill. It's not easy to get this stuff right, to spot it, to work out what's wrong with an argument. It takes a lot of effort and continued learning. So you need to keep working at it, keep learning and keep honing your skills. In fact, that's a good takeaway from this entire lecture series. I've only touched on the foundations of science, and there are many things that I've missed. There are probably things that I got wrong, and I'm sure there are things that I didn't explain as well as I could possibly have done. The task of becoming a good scientist doesn't finish at the end of a lecture series, or a school class or a degree course. Being a scientist is like being an athlete. You can't just read a book on running and expect to compete in the Olympics tomorrow. You have to train. You have to use your skills, reading scientific papers, studying the work of pseudoscientists and asking yourself if they follow the scientific method, if their arguments stand up to scrutiny, and if their evidence supports their claims. And you need to keep working at it, because like physical fitness, mental fitness is a lifetime project. I'll put the notes for this lecture up on my blog at Frayn.net, where you can also follow the other many and varied projects that I'm working on. And you can leave your comments and questions. In particular, if there's an aspect of science that you don't understand, then drop me a note and I'll see if I can produce a presentation on that very subject. Thanks very much for listening to this entire lecture series. I hope it's been a valuable resource for you. I don't know exactly what my next plans are going to be. I'll possibly go back to writing up some of the book ideas I've been sitting on for way too long. I'll keep you posted on my progress via the blog at Frayn.net. Remember, science isn't just about middle-aged men in white coats wandering about in labs with beakers of coloured chemicals bubbling away. In fact, it's not about that at all. Science is a way of seeing the world. It's a process and a mindset that should influence our approach to claims. I said at the beginning that this lecture series wasn't about dumping a load of information about specific scientific theories on you, and I haven't done that at all, but I at least hope that I've given you a sense of how science works, so that you can continue on with your lives, perhaps seeing the world in a slightly different way, maybe protected against the dangers of pseudoscience and superstition, and more able to approach life with an open but sceptical mind. And maybe you'll see fit to pass this newfound knowledge on to those around you, and continue this brave idea of science into the generations to come. Thanks very much for your time.